Welcome back to FM Live. My name is Mike Ussery. I'm going to be your host today, and we are talking about fixing your vacuum leaks. That's right. We're not talking about Bissell's. We're not talking about your fancy-dancy, expensive name brand vacuum cleaner. We're talking about vacuum leaks and why that needs to be an issue that you should be aware of and how to take care of it. So first of all, thank you very much for chiming in with us. We got a lot of questions that popped up whenever we announced this video yesterday. I will be covering some of those questions today. If I don't cover some of the questions that either we talked about before or that you had suggested here now, drop us a question down in the comments below and I'll try to cover it during the video if we can. If not, we'll make sure that we get back to you after the video is posted. So thank you again. Let's go ahead and jump right into it. Now, for those of you who may not know, let's just start with the basics. Vacuum leak. What is vacuum? So vacuum is something that has to do with airflow. And as you might have heard, engines in cars are pretty much just big air pumps. Their job is to move air from outside through the intake, air filter, right? Through your intake system into the engine, where it combusts along with fuel and spark, of course, and then goes out the back of the car as exhaust. It's all airflow, air moving in, it's doing some work, and then it's moving back out again. So vacuum is basically the lack of air. So if you have, say everybody knows what boost is or has heard of boost with turbos and superchargers, right? You're packing more air into one space, namely your engine in the cylinders. Vacuum is the opposite of that. Basically, you have a lack, or at least some degree of a lack of that air in wherever we're talking about. Specifically, in this case, we're talking about between your air filter and your engine. We're talking about the intake side when we're talking about vacuum. So when your car is operating normally, say like you're idling or you're cruising down the highway, basically instances where you don't have your foot down on the throttle pedal much, if at all, then you are actually going to be experiencing, or your engine will be experiencing, vacuum. So you have airflow that's moving through the system. It is moving, but basically it is under vacuum. It's not pressurized. So that's pretty normal. Now, whenever you are, like if you have a naturally aspirated car, your engine pretty much almost always operates in vacuum unless you have a really dialed in intake setup. If you have boost, of course, there's a threshold where you cross over from that point where you have all vacuum over to boost, which is always fun, right? But even those cars can experience vacuum leaks. And what that means is that for cars like, say, we've got this car, this is a 95 Miata with our stage 1 turbo kit, but even a stock car that has your mass airflow sensor that'll be right here after your air filter, you have this sensor that's measuring this airflow. Now this is important because that's how the engine knows how much fuel it also needs to match that amount of airflow. So I could, just for instance, I'll take this filter off. I could remove that and it's not going to change because everything that comes through this sensor is measured. All the air that passes through that sensor is measured. Now, what happens if air gets sucked in after the sensor? So somewhere on this side, what if air gets sucked in? This sensor has no idea that that happened. And so what that can cause is a slight leak condition, or it could be a major leak condition depending on how bad of a leak it is. So one, your engine's not going to know how much air is coming through because you basically have your metered air, but then you also have some unmetered air that's coming through. The engine doesn't know it, has no idea. So it's just guessing at the fueling. It's only seeing what this airflow meter can tell it to kind of accommodate for how much fuel. So this unmetered air means that your overall air-fuel ratio is running a little bit lean. And also your engine's probably going to be stumbly. You may even completely stall out the engine because your ratio is so lean that it just stops, it dies. It can't maintain running because the air-fuel ratio is so out of whack. So that's a bad thing, obviously. If it's bad enough, usually that's when you notice it. You'll pull up to a stoplight, you'll stop, and then all of a sudden the engine, and then you have to embarrassingly restart your engine at the stoplight while everybody's looking, right? I'm sure many people can relate to that. So that's a problem that you'll encounter if your vacuum leak is bad enough. Now, if it's just a slight vacuum leak, and I'll show you here in just a second what that's like, that it'll just be kind of stumbly, rumbly. You may have a slightly high idle because it's trying to keep up, but it's just a tiny vacuum leak. So as a worst case scenario, usually the problem is that it just dies. Most vacuum leaks will cause tuning issues if you're running an aftermarket computer, and that can be quite a big problem. But for stock cars, really it's just a drivability thing, and you can't really do anything about it except for to find it and fix it. And this is going to be the same kind of procedure for either option. If you've got a stock car or a modified car, I'll show you how we can go about finding those leaks and taking care of them. So one of the questions before we get into that, will it hurt my engine, or basically what other problems could it cause? And potentially if you run it with a vacuum leak for long enough, yeah, especially on an aftermarket computer, you potentially could cause some long-term damage, but generally speaking, if it's that bad of a problem, you're usually just going to run into issues where it stumbles and dies, which should be one of those, hey, there's something going on. I need to take a look and get this fixed before I go too much further. So yes, it can cause some long-term damage, but if you're paying attention and you know that you need to take care of the problem, it's an easy problem to fix in most applications. So I've already done a bunch of talking. Let's actually do some looking now. So I've already said we've got one of our cars. It's a 95 with one of our Stage 1 turbo kits, and it's got a fully sealed system, or it should. So as of right now, everything in the system after the mass airflow sensor is a sealed system. Now, if you don't know how to check for vacuum leaks, there's two basic ways that are fairly straightforward. So you don't know where this vacuum leak is in most cases, unless you've got a hose that's just, ripped open, torn. Actually, this is a common issue on cars with the stock intake elbow, or crossover pipe sometimes, that these bellows, they flex because the engine moves around. And oftentimes, if you've got a really old crossover pipe, your bellows may actually be torn. You may actually have a rip down in here. Oftentimes it's on the bottom where, if it's installed, you look at it, oh yeah, it's fine, but then you take it off and flip it over, oh, it's not fine. So that can be a cause of a vacuum leak. That's a very common one if you've got stock components. Another very common one if you don't have stock components, say you have a turbo kit or supercharger or some kind of intake setup that's aftermarket, is that you'll have various clamps that will be all throughout your intake system. And so you'll have different components that are all attached, connected to each other. And you may not have these quite tight enough, or you may have a component that if it's aftermarket, that it's been rubbing up against something, and now you have a hole in that component. So aftermarket stuff, especially if you're not really familiar with what it is, you may have to do some poking around to really find out where that problem is, because you may have an issue that's kind of tucked down in the engine bay where it's hard to access. So the easiest way, if you have access to it, to find out if you've got a leak and be able to tell where it is to use a smoke machine. So a smoke machine, I'll kind of push it around here. A smoke machine is just a little device that if you've ever went to any crazy parties back in the 90s, where they got the lights and the techno music bouncing, that kind of stuff, they have a smoke machine and it's just billowing out lots of smoke. That's basically the same kind of thing, just on a smaller, more portable scale. So this machine has a little hose, an outlet, and then when I press the trigger, you may not be able to see it. Yeah, it's probably hard to see on camera. Hopefully you can see a little bit of that now. But now we have some visual indication, if I were to plumb this into the intake system, to show that's where your leak is. Now, if you had a fully, completely sealed system, when you pump this in there, you shouldn't see any smoke, right? So what we're gonna do here is a little thought experiment slash visual aid, and I am going to do two things. So one, I have to plumb this into the intake system. And also two, I have to plug up any other openings that I don't want that smoke to escape that I know are okay. So in this particular case, I'm going to take off the air filter. And then I'm going to use a cap on the air filter opening on the inlet to the mass airflow sensor. And then all I'm going to do now is take off another hose. And this is a pretty tight fit. I've already checked it out. Shove it down in there. So now this is totally sealed. And as the smoke travels through the system, we should be able to see if there's any leaks. Now I'll go ahead and get this running, so it'll be noisy for just a second here. And while I'm doing this, just to explain a bit more, this system will be different from your system if you've got a different intake setup, if you've got a supercharger or somebody else's turbo kit, of course. So you may need to get a little bit creative with how you do this if you're using a smoke tester. So I can see there's a little bit coming out here, and that's okay. I already know this is where it's coming in, so not a big deal. Now, also, if you've got a intercooler or any kind of intake piping that goes out underneath or in front of the radiator, you'll need to be poking around underneath the car, checking out all of your different hose clamps, different connections, if you've got any fittings, if you've got any sensors, that kind of stuff that you need to worry about where there's not just a component that's a tube. If it's got holes in it that other stuff is plugged into, you'll need to be checking those. So I'll just unhook one of these hoses to show you. So this is after the throttle body here, but as I continue to pump in this smoke, you'll start to see it come out the hose. And this will take a few seconds because I'm pumping all the way through the turbo, the intercooler, and the piping up over to the intake manifold. And normally this process will take a couple of minutes to get everything filled up with smoke because it's not moving a whole bunch of air. We're not really trying to pressurize it much. It might be a couple of PSI for what this pump is actually doing. But there, now you can see there's smoke coming out of this little nipple here. So you can, hopefully you can see it coming out. I don't know if that's any easier. But now I know that my manifold has smoke in it. I'm just going to plug this back up. And now, if I were to use this again, everything's plugged up. I should be able to see the smoke. And if you're using a smoke tester, you can use any kind of flashlight, or if you've got one that's, you know, flashlight and UV, sometimes that helps, just depending on what you have access to. But now, I could continue doing this until I see that there may be smoke coming up out of a fitting, or another tricky one that's not that common but happens sometimes is the injector O-ring seats. They do have rubber around the injectors where it sits into the head, and that's where, if your O-ring seats are, or injector seats are cracked, you may actually see some smoke coming out from right here. So that means you need to replace those. But this is a handy visual way to see how to find a vacuum leak. And it will, again, it's low pressure, a couple PSI. It will also help show if you have a small boost leak, or just a really obvious boost leak, of course. So, but this is a real easy way to do it if you have access to one. If you don't, and I understand many people probably don't have this in their garage, and that's okay. There are other ways that are even easier, low tech, to be able to do it. Ooh, spooky. This is October, right? So, you know, Captain Bob's just getting into the festive spirit. And this smoke doesn't hurt anything. It's not going to hurt the engine. Another easy way to tell if you've got vacuum leaks is to use carb cleaner spray or even brake cleaner spray. Now, these are solvents. And the reason why you want to use a solvent is because we're going to be spraying these around the engine bay, and we're aiming for the different connections where there might be a leak between components. But solvents, they will dry completely, they don't leave any residue, and they're also flammable to some certain extent. Carb cleaner spray is a bit more flammable, so it's a better one to use if it's fresh. This one is actually quite old, so I won't be using this. It doesn't work quite as well, but for this, I'll show you the demonstration of what happens if you get a vacuum leak. So let me go ahead and start up the engine. Okay, so just for FYI, this engine is in mechanically good shape, idling about 850 RPM as it should, so nothing really is abnormal about this engine as it sits, other than the turbo kit. But idle characteristics and driving characteristics right now are the same as if it were stock. So this is totally applicable to stock cars, but it also works for modified cars as well. Now, I'm going to introduce a vacuum leak, and hopefully you'll be able to pick it up on my mic that you can hear the engine speed changing. Right now it's fluctuating a little bit, but just as it normally would. Whenever I pull off one of these hoses to introduce a big vacuum leak, you'll hear that it will change and it'll kind of rumble, stumble a little bit. You can kind of see it moving around a little bit. It's not making a huge difference. So this is a relatively small vacuum leak, basically, just this little nipple right here. And hopefully you can hear the idle quality change. I don't know how easy it is with this mic. So here we got a vacuum leak. Now when I spray this, say if I were spraying the connections, I'm going to obviously spray it because I know this is where the vacuum leak is. Did you hear that? Hopefully you did. The engine speed came up because right now it's running lean. But when I spray some solvent in there, it runs rich for just a moment because I'm introducing fuel, essentially. And this is unmetered fuel. So it will rev up just for a brief moment. And this would be true if you were spraying this down in the injector O-rings and they were cracked, or if you had some other components that were not tight. If you had a leak, you can use a solvent spray to make sure that you don't have leaks in certain spots or find the leaks that you are having trouble finding just visually if you don't have a smoke machine. Okay. So, we've talked about what they are, what is a common, or what are common issues or places to find vacuum leaks. We've talked about how the different methods of diagnosing it, whether you're using the vacuum, whether you're using a smoke machine, or if you're using carb spray. One of the questions that we had gotten asked about is, for whatever reason, if we don't have access to a smoke machine, okay, but we don't even have carb cleaner, we don't have brake clean, how can I diagnose a vacuum leak in another method? Is there any other way? Yes. So this is where, if you don't already own one, go find a buddy who owns a Subaru and then have him come over, tell him that you've got lots of sick turbo parts that you want to show him, whatever you can do to convince him to come over, and then have him bring his vape pen with him. Now this sounds silly. It does work, and actually, if you want to see it in action, unfortunately, I couldn't find any Subaru owners to show you an example today. But if you want to see what it looks like, you can jump on over to the Car Passion channel by Greg Peters. He has a video where he does most of the same kind of diagnosis, but he actually shows a vape pen where he uses it as if it were a smoke machine. So puff, puff, blow into the intake system, and he was able to use that to diagnose where his vacuum leaks were. It's very low tech, but it does work. So yes, there are other methods out there, and I'm sure that somebody else will chime in with another way. If you think of another way or have used another way to diagnose vacuum leaks, we'd love to hear about it. Tell us down in the comments below. So, other than that, let's see. I think that we've covered all of the pre-video questions. Do we have anything that has popped up live that I haven't already covered?
Kind of. Do we sell the cold air intake shroud?
Do we sell a cold air intake what? Shroud. So not really related to the vacuum leak stuff, but short answer is maybe. If we've got it for like a stage 1 turbo kit, NA, NB stage 1 turbo kit, we do have what we call a hush kit. We also carry these air boxes as well. So say if you had your own cold air intake, even if you didn't have a turbo, you potentially could use one of our airbox kits. Sure. If you've got something else that I'm not really thinking of that you're talking about, give us a call. That way we can help you out, because maybe you've got something different than what we're making assumptions on. Any other questions? Vacuum related? Okay. All right. So we've got one more, apparently. Maybe it's not popping up for them.
Same process for boost leaks.
Oh, okay. So the question is, can we use the same process for boost leaks? To an extent. Now, the reason why it's not always directly applicable is because you may have, like in the case of our intake pipes that are made of a reinforced or a Nomex reinforced nylon strand silicone hose, that you may have a cut in it, and then under vacuum, that small cut just pulls itself shut and you don't notice any kind of odd behavior because there isn't a vacuum leak. But if it's after the turbo, that when your turbo or your supercharger starts working and it starts filling up your intercooler piping with boost, then that small hole, instead of being sucked closed, is now getting blown open. And that may happen at 1 PSI, it may happen at 10 PSI, 20. It just depends. If you've got an intermittent issue where you're losing boost pressure at a certain level, then you may have to get creative on how you go about finding that. One way that if you're able to do it is to go to a dyno or a rolling road. Have your car set up on the dyno so that way you can have the car rolling along making boost, but it's stationary, so you can be looking around and, you know, even using if you want to. Probably not a great idea if on the dyno and loading up making boost, but you may be able to see or probably hear a boost leak happening, because if it's only happening when that hose or whatever it is being forced open with the boost pressure, probably you're going to hear it before you see it. Now, otherwise, there are ways that you could diagnose that just sitting still. Potentially, if you have the right equipment or fittings, you could block everything up, take your air filter off, and put in like a piece of PVC with a quick disconnect fitting for like a pneumatic system, and then start pumping it full of air from your air compressor. And then you'll probably hear the leak whenever it happens at whatever PSI. You'll definitely need a regulator. So don't just go filling your intake system with 100 PSI. Bad things will probably happen. I don't know what your stuff is rated for, but 100 PSI is not usually what your intake system is going to be seeing. So yes, there are ways, but you have to be more creative, is the short answer. Anything else?
Can you use a smoke machine or that method to find an exhaust leak?
Good question. So it's not related to a vacuum leak, but just because we were showcasing the use of a smoke machine, a question came in about, can you use a smoke machine to diagnose exhaust leaks? And the answer is absolutely. So one of the tools I didn't even show you is this guy. This is an adapter that will go on the end of your smoke machine tube. And obviously it's conically shaped, so it will stick into an orifice of whatever size. But this is pretty common with smoke machines. So you could simply plug this into your tailpipe. You'd probably want your exhaust system to be cold, or at least not blazing hot, so that way you don't damage any of your smoke machine equipment. But absolutely, plug this in the tailpipe, and if you've got exhaust leaks, you will start to see smoke coming out of whatever flange or broken weld or whatever it is that's causing your exhaust leak. So, super handy tool. If you don't have one, or if you don't have a buddy that has one, start making more friends, because they are useful. I recommend them. Okay, anything else? Okay, all right. So again, if I didn't get your question, if it didn't run through in time, or it was about something else, we will answer it in the comments below. Thank you very much for joining us today in our episode of FM Live talking about vacuum leaks. If If you have any other questions, not even related to this, but you want to reach out to one of us to talk about your car, upgraded plans, whatever, feel free to reach out at support@flyinmiata.com, or you can call us at 970-464-5600. We'd be happy to talk to you. And also, as mentioned last week by Jeremy, we are building a huge knowledge base. It's kind of small at the moment, but we're getting there. Give us some time. But we're trying to put a lot of the knowledge that's been up here in a lot of our minds out into the internet, so that way you can access it anytime you want. You don't even have to wait till we're open. Novel idea, right? So if you haven't already, head over to help.flyinmiata.com. Check it out. If you got any suggestions for specifics that you'd like to see on the knowledge base, you can also drop us a line, let us know, and we'd be happy to start plugging that kind of stuff in there as well. Anyway, I have rambled on forever and ever today, so I will leave it at that. Again, thank you very much. We will see you again this time next week at FM Live. Thanks again. Have a good one.